Hello everybody, my name is Lynn Scanella and welcome to my podcast Fruitful Conversations, where we chat to people who can share their stories to teach and inspire us to be better versions of ourselves. Now my guest today is Nigel Collin, founder of the Ingenious Oz Project and the Game of Inches business process. Now, as both, he helps organisations lead change by shifting the mindset of people to focus on small improvements, the inches, that are manageable and effective. He is an author, a mentor, a facilitator, a coach, and as a speaker, a conference speaker, he has pretty impressive credentials. Nigel is a CSP, a certified speaking professional, which is the highest accreditation that you can gain internationally. He has spoken to more than 800,000 people collectively over 1,000 different events in 14 different countries. And he is the only Australian speaker to be awarded Outstanding Contribution to Meetings and Events. We spoke about getting creative, losing businesses, how change is a game of inches, motorbikes, chocolate, and a guy called Dennis. I know that you'll really enjoy my conversation with the very sweet and knowledgeable Nigel Collin. So, hello, Nige.
Hello, Lynn. How are you doing?
I'm great, and welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on this time.
I am honoured to be asked because I am loving this series.
Oh, thanks. Thanks.
Yeah,
I'm actually really enjoying doing it. You get to, I think the biggest thing is talking to so many interesting people, and when they share their stories, the idea is that people can always take stuff away from it. Things
Isn't that fascinating?
They can learn and apply because everyone has everyone's got a good story, everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can draw from it what we need at the time. You listen to these again in 12 months and you'll learn something new.
Yeah, okay, so no pressure on you because we need to learn something from you today, Nigel Collin.
You've come to the wrong person.
Oh, okay, well, this is a great way to start. I will ask you a good question because this is interesting. This is fascinating me. A few years ago, you had the ingenious idea to get on your beloved motorbike and ride around Australia talking to amazing people about amazing stuff that they were doing. Tell me how the Ingenious Oz Project was born.
Wow, it kind of evolved. So do you want the real story or the marketing story?
Let's do both. Let's go real.
Okay, so I grew up, as you know, in business events. I had an entertainment business for many years. It wasn't an agency. We created entertainment. So we called it entertainment design.
Yep.
And through that, I've worked with some really clever, creative people, but I've also realized very early in my career how often the best ideas, some of the most creative solutions come from people you would never expect. You know, people like just you and I who are doing our thing, all of a sudden say something because they see it in a different way. And what I also have learned through that process is most people don't actually think they're very creative, right? Yeah. We park creativity as something artists do, or you've got to have a ponytail, drink lattes and stuff like that. And I was at this conference and I remember the name of the conference and I remember where the conference was. I don't remember the speaker, but this guy was up on stage and he said something absurd like, if you're going to be innovative and you're going to be creative, you've got to be like Steve Jobs. And I remember sitting in the audience going, no, you don't. And as soon as you say that, you've completely disconnected 90% of people. Because I'm not Steve Jobs, right? I think I'm quite a creative guy, but the guy was a freak and a genius.
Yes.
So I kind of at that point, this sounds really weird. I just wanted to prove it wrong. I just wanted to go out and prove that everybody is creative. Innovation belongs to everybody. And I was also into motorbikes at the time. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could join the two together? And I don't know when it happened, but I'm just going to go, I'm going to do a motorbike trip and I'm going to go interview just normal people and prove we're much more creative than we give ourselves credit for. And
I like that idea.
I sat on that for about 6 months. And then I was speaking in Darwin at a conference and I managed to convince the organisers to let me ride my motorbike from Sydney down through to the bottom of Australia, the Bight, Port Augusta, and then up through the desert and interview people and talk about what I discovered, which was a bit risky. And they went, yeah, that sounds fantastic. And that's kind of how it was born. And it's continued on. And what started out as proving we're all more creative than we think we are actually ended up being a business research kind of thing, because what I learned from a business perspective was far greater than I ever imagined. Let's
say when you're in the outback, because that's fascinating to a lot of people living in the city, have you got a favourite story of somebody doing something really special that you met out there?
I've got lots of favourite stories.
Okay, so pick one, otherwise we'll be here all day.
Yeah, I think my favourite was these two old guys, elderly gentlemen. I don't want to get you into trouble, but they were old blokes.
Yep.
Riding their push bikes or bicycles, pedal cycle. If you say push bikes in America, no one knows what you mean, by the way.
Oh, don't they? Oh.
No, I'd said it once at a conference. They all looked at me like I was an idiot. What the hell are you talking about? Anyway, they're cycles, they're bicycles, right? Yes. They're riding. And so I'm in the middle of the desert. And I was also writing an article for a magazine, a motorcycle magazine. And the article was titled The People You Meet. Yeah. And you know me, I'm actually, when I'm not doing what I'm doing, I'm actually quite shy and don't want to talk to anybody, right? Which is kind of weird. But, and I think, I better interview these. So these guys are pedaling their bicycles in the middle of the desert. It would have been 300K south of Alice, 300K north of Cooper. So it's the middle of nowhere.
Yep.
I rocked up to them and I turned on my video camera as I'm riding along, and I kind of, well, what are you guys doing? And they're like, well, we're riding our push bikes to Alice Springs. So anyway, cut a long story short, I pulled over and we got talking, and I pulled out my video camera and I said, can I interview you? And they said, yeah. And I remember one of the questions I asked them, because you kind of do see that every so often, but these guys were like, one of them was 75 years old, and it's 1,500 kilometers they're pedaling.
Yeah, I'm guessing they're not wearing Lycra.
No. And they had, thank God, they had trailers or little trolleys behind their bikes with all their water in there. And they'd sleep by the side of the road, and they didn't just go straight up. They go bush every so often to places like Unadada, which is 150K on a road that you don't take your own motor car, like hire someone else's kind of road. And I said, why are you doing this? Are you like raising money for charity or whatever? And he looked at me, the guy's name was Dennis, and he looked at me and I'll never forget it. He said, no, we just had this idea and wanted to do it. And it's always stuck with me, because they didn't have committee meetings. They didn't vacillate over it. They just had an idea, literally got on their bikes and made it happen. Yeah. And that has always stayed with me. And I often think, and in the business, we go, oh, will I do this? Will I not do that? Should I change this on my website? Should I not do that? I literally now say to myself, what would Dennis do?
Yeah,
because Dennis would just do it, right?
Yeah.
And it's the biggest lesson, because we all get caught up in this fear of doing in case we make a mistake.
Yeah, we do.
And people in the desert, especially the Northern Territory, have this kind of philosophy of have a crack. Just that I give it a crack. And it's what would Dennis, it's probably the most inspiring person I have ever met because of that. And like, I've met a lot of people.
Yes, you have.
It's the one that stands out. And to the fact that Brad's Ingenious partner, we've even printed T-shirts with what would Dennis do on them, and give them out every so often.
Fantastic. I love that thought of, and if you don't have a Dennis, for listeners, if you don't have a Dennis in your life, actually all of us have a Dennis in our lives. So think about that person who thinks really differently to you. That's what I like. And then what would Dennis do? Yeah.
And the other thing I love about it, Lynn, is like I kept in touch with him for quite a few years, and I haven't heard from him for a while. So I hope he's still out there pedaling away.
Hey, listen, you said that a lot of people will say I'm not creative, and I think that's the first response of so many people. What are the barriers? What stops us being creative?
Wow, that's a really big question.
Okay, so give me bullet points, because I suspect you're not a bullet point kind of a guy.
No, I'm not. Okay. There's really an interesting exercise you can do, which I'll get to after this. But the big ones are perception, right? We don't think we're creative because we put creative people in a box, right? We've gone, you have a ponytail, you're creative. You don't. And what happens in business is we look around and we've got our creative department or whatever it is, or our creative agency. And by going, you're creative, you're not creative. You're creative, you're not creative. You're creative, you're not creative. We literally halve the potential of ideas we can generate in our businesses. So the first one is we actually label creativity.
Mm-hmm.
which is weird. So it's a perception issue, right?
Yeah.
So we just got to get, creativity belongs to everyone, and it's not about painting.
Yeah.
Fear is probably the biggest outside of that.
Yeah.
Fear of failure, fear of ridicule.
Looking stupid.
Right, especially in,
yeah,
well, especially we've all sat in brainstorm sessions, right, where someone's come up with an idea and someone else goes, yeah, right, like that'll work.
Yeah,
everyone in that group is now silenced because they don't want to look like idiots, right? Time pressure, none of us have any time. We think that creativity takes a lot of time, and sometimes it can be very fast. So there's a whole. What's really interesting is we often think the constraints around us in business inhibit our creativity. In other words, I have to abide by the budget, the policies of the company, the legislative issues of government.
Yes.
All of the values, all of that sort of stuff. And how can I possibly come up with any ideas? It's actually the opposite. By knowing those things, by knowing what your constraints are, you can actually get really creative in how you solve things, which is why I love the people of the outback. Here he goes, putting him into a box in his own right. But what you find when you're in the middle of nowhere and you don't have resources and you don't have the income and you don't have the support, or the communications aren't great, you get really creative about how you solve problems. There's a really interesting exercise you can do. There was a guy called George Land in the 60s who was a psychologist and an educator and did this great study. He gave a creativity test to a bunch of 5-year-old kids. And 98, how he ranked it, and 98% of them scored highly creative according to his ranking. Then he gave the same test to the same kids 5 years later, and only 30% scored highly creative. And they've already done the test, right?
Yeah.
Then he gave it to the same kids another 5 years later. They're 15 now.
Yeah.
15 years old. They've done the test twice.
Yeah.
12% of them scored highly creative. And then he gave it to a bunch of adults. 2% scored highly creative. Now, it was done a long time ago, and the gap is probably lessened. Yeah. However, what it indicates is as we go through life, we tend to use our creativity less. And what's important is that George Land specifically states that we don't lose our creativity. We just use it less.
Yes, because of the things you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. And I often do a workshop piece where you get a room of people, you go, okay, so having discussed that, write down all the things that you think inhibit you thinking creatively. And people will always come up with time, regulations, fear of this, fear of that. Yeah. And then once you've got that list, you can get into a creative mode of trying to break them down. And that actually gets you to be more creative again. So there's a heap of different barriers. And as we go through life, we keep adding them. And I think the main one, to be honest, is most people just don't think they're creative because they've been beaten down or told they're not. Yeah. Or they just get too busy,
It's true, Nigel. I think I have to throw my mother in it here, because when I was young, I remember wanting to do art at school, and Mum said, "Oh, darling, I can't draw, and you probably can't either." And that's all she said. And now we laugh about it. I go, I blame you for all my insecurities, but bless our little cotton socks. But those sort of things will just stop you immediately. And I have to add, because I adore my mother, I wanted to be like her, so I actually was happy with that, which is a weird twist. But that's been stopped me all my life. If you say to me, "Are you creative?" my first answer is no. I'm not the creative one in the family.
Yeah,
so
and by whose measure?
Yes, by my own.
Like you may not be Gauguin or
correct.
Elon Musk, but you can still be creative in the way that you think.
In the way that you think, the way that you solve problems, the way that you deal with change. So speaking of change, I know that as we record, we're still in the middle of COVID-19 pandemic. You and Brad have been doing some interviews called The Big Pivot around organisations, talking to businesses who've been able to change and pivot during this time. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So with Ingenious, we often go out on our motorbikes, because we've opened the motorbikes, and there's nothing like riding through the desert and you literally not literally run into people, but as you meet people, you find these interesting stories, and we can't do that now with COVID. So we decided to do virtual interviews, and we called it The Big Pivot because neither of us like the word pivot. I think pivot is one of those overgeneralized words that scares people because it kind of has the assumptive nature that, to pivot, you've got to come up with the next Uber of a business model, or you've got to completely reinvent your industry. And it's not true. You can tweak, you can dance, you can change. So we call it the big pivot because pivot's a big word and everyone seems to want to do it. But when you go and talk to people, what we're finding, which is really interesting, is people are tweaking and adjusting and being adaptable, but very few have completely reinvented themselves. There are those who have done it successfully.
Yeah.
And what's even greater than that, I think, is, and there's one example. We spoke to a restaurant in Darwin called Wharf One, which is right opposite the convention centre, and voted Northern Territory's best restaurant. And they obviously had to close their doors. Now, obviously now NT are doing quite well, but back then everything was closed, and they make their own pasta. So what they started to do was home deliver homemade pasta. They started to sell their pasta directly to their customers, and then they managed to get people like IGA involved, and so they opened up this whole new distribution channel for their homemade pasta, right? Which is fresh and has always had a great. When you say Wharf One in Darwin, people just equate it to pasta, right? And what's interesting is that I was talking to a guy called Darren who runs the place with his partner Pina. He went, it's something we've wanted to do for years, but we just never got around to it. And COVID kind of forced our hand. And you see this time and again, people have been wanting to do stuff in the back of their minds. And COVID has come along, and all of a sudden it's forced us into a corner where we have to think more creatively about how we do what we do. And we're seeing lots of these examples. Another one, which hasn't gone up yet, but there's a guy in South Australia, in Adelaide, who runs a chocolate place.
Tell me what he did. Tell me
well,
what the guy
he
did.
looked at what's going on with social distancing. How can I capitalize on this? And what they did is they created social distancing chocolate. So what you can do is buy a 1.5 meter cylinder full of chocolate, right? It's a very simple idea. Like he's not making chocolate in 1.5 meters.
Yes.
He's simply
fills a cylinder
for it, and it's become, and he's run out. He's out of stock when we spoke to him.
Fantastic. And so he's using something that he already has. He's using the skills that he has, the knowledge that he has, but he's just thought a little bit differently about doing it.
Correct. Melba's chocolates. There you go.
I love that. All right. Thank you.
And a really interesting guy. This is the other thing about this stuff, Lynn, and you'll know this from interviewing people, but, we got talking to him. He's really enthusiastic about it, family business, all of that stuff. And I said, where did you get have you studied business? He's just so logical about how he thinks. Business is really logical. He goes, I can't believe the amount of retailers who open up shops that don't have parking. And you think about it, you go, you're right. And he goes, we made sure we had ample parking, because if you want people to come into your shop, when obviously lockdowns aren't happening, you've got to have parking. And often we get, and his point I think was, or what I derived from it, is we get so caught up in the ideas that we have, that we fail to check them. We fail to kind of go, is that going to work? What have I missed?
Double check.
And And I just loved it. How many retailers open up without parking?
Yeah, that's funny.
It's like,
it's just using that logic. Every time we have a big idea, I call it my Let's Ask Dennis thing. So I often, when I have big ideas, I have someone in my head, a friend of mine who is extremely logical, but also a hard-headed businesswoman. And I just go, what would you do? And straight away, I know where the answer lies.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and if everyone has that, it helps you balance out. But you have to be self-aware and know where your own flaws and challenges lie, to say, I'm really good at this bit, where I'm missing is that bit. Who's my other half? It's always good.
What I've also learned from all the interviews I've done, just to take you off track, And I grew up in a creative space as a creative person.
Yeah.
And what I've learned is really successful people don't chase ideas. They chase gaps. They go, what does the market need? What do I need to resolve? What's the problem? What's the problem? What's the opportunity? Now, what ideas will suit that? Whereas we're often taught just come up with a heap of ideas, but ideas are a complete waste of time unless they solve a problem, right? Especially in business. The world is full of good ideas sending people broke. So you kind of got to be kind of a bit of business, unless you're an artist, in which case it doesn't matter. But in business, you've got to be you've got to have that balancing act between.
You do have to have the balancing act. So would you say because I know that you're a very good interviewer yourself, and you've interviewed loads and loads of people and CEOs, would you say the most successful ones are those who take this alternate route and look for the gap?
Yes. And I would actually now argue that it's not an alternative route. It just seems to be, I've got to be careful how I say this, but I think successful businesses know it. They just do it, right? So it's not alternate. It's just that a lot of other people don't get it.
This is the way to go. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a fairly standard thing, actually, when you talk to successful people. They always know what are they trying to achieve? What's the problem? What's the opportunity? Now, how we do it is kind of irrelevant.
Because a lot of us, when you talk about problems and change in particular, a lot of people resist change, as you say, because it's hard and it's a little bit scary. But you don't see change that way. You say it doesn't have to be like that.
No, it doesn't have to be like that. Change is a natural part of our world.
It's a constant.
Well, it is. It's very cliche, but it's true. I mean, without change, like everything changes. However, most people see change as a big, audacious kind of thing. There's this myth of big around change. And so for most of us, it seems too big, too hard, too risky, too scary because it reeks of quantum leaps and pivots. Most people are overwhelmed by change, especially now with what's going on. But the antidote to that, which is another thing I learned from all these interviews, is just one step at a time. It's a game of inches to plug it. When you look at change, it's just small steps, one step at a time. It's amazing how, you become inept at change, but change just kind of happens. It's an evolutionary thing. It doesn't have to be a quantum leap. It's not a one-off process. And so the other thing you see in coping with change and dealing with change and actually leading change, what smart people get is it's the small things that matter, which is kind of paradoxical. But if you want a big change to occur, do it in small steps.
We're speaking about it being a game of inches. What I'd like perhaps, or maybe what our listeners would like to know is, can you give us an example of maybe a small business at the moment who might have lost 70% of their business, and you'll say to them, look, just take small steps, find the gap and take small steps. What advice have you got for them?
Yeah. Okay. So, and that can be really daunting at the moment because we're looking at going out the back door pretty fast for a lot of people, especially in like tourism and events and the rest of it. But here's the advice on this one is just kind of take a bit of time and look at what are the gaps. What are some of the things you can tweak or stop doing that are getting in your way? If you try and reinvent your business now, that's risky. That's more risky than small changes. So an example of this is there's a wonderful couple, again in the Northern Territory, Tom and Annabelle Curtin, who have an outback show. It's called the Outback Experience, Catherine Outback Experience. But basically, Tom's a horse trainer and he's won a couple of golden guitars as a country and western singer. And he does this live show. So you go to their farm and he's training up horses and dogs in real time while he's singing songs on the back of a horse. And anything, like when you train horses, anything can kind of happen. So rather than be a scripted, prefabricated facade of a show, it's the real deal, right? So along comes COVID and completely stops everything, right?
Sure.
And what they do, again, like the restaurant in Darwin and again, like our chocolatier, Melba's, in South Australia, they just sort of went, well, what are some of the small things we can do that aren't going to cost us a lot, that are going to be quick, that are going to be easy, that aren't going to take us off course? Yes. And basically they took their show online. So they targeted schools, and they were going into schools, and Tom, being a singer-songwriter and a horseman, would still teach. He's very connected to lessons from the outback and the country way of life, and he'd just take that education online. And then he started coaching online, and basically step by step, they've built this online program. And now that they're opening up again in the Northern Territory, he's kind of assimilating that together and with a new offering. If we go back to Wharf One, and a lot of restaurants were looking at the back door, right? In this COVID thing, a lot restaurants is closed. A lot of them will not reopen. So they could have buried their heads in the sand and gone, well, what are we going to do? Sell the house? But they had this pastor, and they looked at the market and went, what's the opportunity? What's the gap? What do people need? What can we do? And they just tested it. And they tested it just in a small way. Rang up a few of their clients, sold a little bit. And once that worked, they sold a bit more. And so when they reopen, they're now going to have their pasta machine as a major part of the restaurant, and they're going to sell the pasta in the restaurant anyway. And he actually said at one point, we may not even open again because it's going so well. So you don't have to reinvent. So my advice is, look at what you do, what your strengths are. Look at what the market needs, or what are some of the things you can tweak, because those small changes are easy and fast to make, and they can be incredibly profitable.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's good advice.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think you did. I was looking for, if I'm a small business, and I'm thinking also from an individual's point of view, life at the moment can be quite daunting, and everyone's gone through different stages. But I'm not just talking about during COVID. I'm talking about any sort of change that you need to deal with. I think the advice to both businesses and to individuals is just look for the gaps, see what you can do, what resources do you have, and move ahead in baby steps.
In small steps. Don't try to do it at once. So to add to that and to clarify for people, gaps appear. Right? So gaps are simply problems or opportunities, right? COVID has created a massive gap.
Yep.
So gaps appear in three places. So if your listeners are going, well, where do we find these gaps? They're everywhere, right? So there's external gaps, which are market gaps. They're big, hard to cover. They're usually expensive because a lot of R&D goes into that stuff, like creating a smartphone, right? Or Uber or Airbnb. All of those things are market-driven gaps that have been resolved. But they take a lot of resources. Then there are internal gaps. So internal gaps are what you do on your day-to-day basis as a process. So one of the easiest ways of finding gaps is to sit down and think about, what did you do in the last week that you could do better, or that you could stop doing because it's getting in the way? And those little gaps, they're the ones that can save you time, save you money, make you money. And the third area that gaps appear are personal gaps. Like one of my gaps is I get distracted really easily. Yeah. You can tell talking to me, almost all over the place. So I'm, working on being a little bit more regimented in how I approach my day, so I'm not as distracted. And that makes me more productive, which is allowing me to get more done, and it's giving me more time to think.
I wanted to ask you about where you got to now, because you're on stage at the moment. I know that you love being on stage, and you love that whole feeling. Have you always wanted that? Is that something you've always been drawn to?
Yeah. And I don't know where it comes from, but
from an early age, or?
Oh, absolutely. I wanted to be an actor. My dad was in advertising, and I was fascinated with all of that. And I wanted to be a film director, and I went to film school and studied directing and writing. And I've always wanted to be in that area. And I remember when I was about 8, I used to rock up to my dad's office. He was in advertising. And I'd rock up to his, back then, his EA, they call them secretaries. And I'd go, I want to see Daddy's movies, and she'd go, Bob Collins' son's here. And I'd set up one of those old 16mm projectors in a back room. And I would sit there all day during school holidays and just watch all the ads that he made, and I've always had a fascination with it. I don't know where it comes from.
Right.
But I just always have. And I grew up in quite a creative family. I'm very grateful for that. And, their mates were actors and film producers and stuff like that. So I was just exposed to it, I think.
You're really lucky.
Age. Yeah. So although I've ended up in a very business-oriented world, that's still, it's always been important to me.
Sounds like you also got a lot. Yeah, it is your thing. And you got a lot of encouragement from your mum and dad, which is, it's not always the case. So you're really fortunate. So you went to film school, you went to acting school.
Yep.
You were an actor for
dropped out of
years.
each, by the way.
That's all right.
Well, I dropped out of acting school because I started getting work as an actor. So I was like, well,
right.
Why finish? I'm getting work.
Okay.
Same with film guys. I'm doing it. Why? Done.
Yeah, and I think I actually, I don't know when I met you, but I certainly know that I've been to some of the classes that you used to run on presenting to camera. So you've actually got, in conference world, you've got a lot of things that everybody else wants. You're good on stage and you can present on camera, because as we have pirouetted, and I know, like in our world, for everyone listening, and this is probably the same, not just for conference speakers, but for lots of people, you're having to get better at speaking into a camera on Zoom, on whatever it is, and they're two different skills. So
completely,
and you can do both. So you're very lucky to be able to do that. So my question to you is: you've had a couple of failed businesses. One when in your 20s, one 20 years later. How? And knowing what you do now, how did you deal with those in a different way? Did you deal with those any differently?
Completely differently. So yeah, mind you, I've had 2 ones that didn't go well. I've had 3 that went really well.
Okay.
So that's okay. Let's just put that out there.
All right.
Yeah. Woohoo. Yeah. So the first one, I was really young, and I actually, so I've never been broke. I've never declared bankruptcy, because the first one I lost. I had my first business at 20, sold it at 21, bought my first house at 22,
right.
And I lost it. I don't know if I lost it at 23 or 22, but it was around like a year later. It was all gone. And I borrowed money off my dad. And so I was actually beyond broke for the first one. So, like, I was 22, 23 years old, and I was 50 grand in debt, and I paid every cent back because that was important. But back then it kind of didn't knock me around so much, because you're young, and you kind of go, oh, well, I'll just do something else. And that's what then I got a job, and I hated that. And then I went into acting. I decided at 27 I'd be a full-time actor. So I went to acting school at 27. And that led to Absurd Entertainment, my next business, which was just a great...
You had that for 10 years or something, didn't you?
Yeah. And so it's funny, in the words of Steve Jobs, you can connect the dots in hindsight, kind of thing. So the first one didn't knock me around too much.
And you're resilient at that age.
Well, yeah. I don't know if you're resilient or you just don't. Maybe.
You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. But what's interesting, we talked about serendipity, is my wife and I then got together during that time, and our house got burgled. And we lost everything. But because we just got together, we had 2 TVs, 2 of everything, right? And the insurance company goes, well, here's we'll replace everything. And I remember as a young, and I don't know if you get away with it now as a 23-year-old or something, I remember ringing up the insurance company and going, why are you giving us everything? We have 2 of everything. We don't need it. Can't you just give me a check? And they went, well, we don't do that. I went, why not? You're just going to give me 2 TVs. I don't need 2 TVs. Can't you just give me the money? And they did. And it virtually paid off all my debt. It's
that's
funny
lucky.
how things... It's fun. And then all this sort of stuff happens, if you just sort of let it unfold. The second time hit me a lot harder, because I had 3 houses and share portfolios and everything. And it wasn't so much the business that went turtle. It was a perfect storm of all sorts of stuff that went on in my personal life, and all sorts of things went on that I just couldn't cope with the business.
Sure.
And it was after GFC, and it was just messy. And, there were probably 4 or 5 factors at play. And if there was only 3 or 4, I probably would have survived it. But, we didn't lose everything, but we walked away with a big dent. And that knocks you around mentally. Like, I don't really speak about this, Lynn. So well done.
You don't have to.
Well, I just don't want to revisit it, but it knocked me around, because all of a sudden you've worked all your life to build up, a reputation, or to build up a portfolio, or to have a home, in a good suburb and all of that. And all of a sudden you're looking at, hang on, where did the last 20 years of effort go? So it knocks you around. And it took me probably a good many years to sort of come through the other side of that. And now I look at it as kind of, I wouldn't call it a badge of honor, but and I wouldn't call it normal, but it's not unnormal. And it's just, if you're going to be in business, Well, let's be really honest about this. And I've spoken to so many people who have been through similar, like so many of them.
Yeah.
If you're going to be in business, you're going to have hard times.
So I guess the
You've got to
answer
accept
to that,
it, I think is what I'm saying, is you know, you can sit there and go, what's the lesson? I'd rather not have learned anything.
Mm-hmm.
To be really honest with you, I'd rather
I was just going to say that's
that.
a really honest answer.
Well, it's, you know, everyone goes, oh, yes, but there's great learnings from it. Well, maybe.
Yeah.
But I'd rather have not gone to that university.
Yeah, I understand.
So you just kind of got to accept it and move on and, you know, learn from your mistakes. I'd rather learn from someone else's mistakes.
So would I, thank you. Especially now, you know, I think that by the time you get to a certain stage in your life, you go, okay, yep, hard knocks, please, no more hard knocks. But life isn't like that. Life is full of peaks and troughs. It's just the way that it is.
That's really interesting. You just opened up something. When my wife and I first got together, we've been married 32 years or something now. I don't know, whatever. Anyway, when we first got together, I remember sitting down and we discussed that we never wanted to do weekends, right? And what we meant by that was we didn't want to have to go on a picnic on a Saturday because we worked 9 to 5.
Yes.
If we wanted to go have a cup of coffee, we could do it whenever we wanted. We didn't have to wait for the weekend to go have lunch with friends.
Yes. Yeah.
So we decided we would never do weekends. We never have, right? And I don't mean by that we've been lazy, but owning your own business gives you that sense of freedom. And I think what it taught me the second time around, because when you're young, you're ambitious. You know, when you're in your 40s, late 40s, I think what I learned from it is how important the lifestyle is that we had and that we still have, and that it didn't actually disrupt that. We still don't do the 9 to 5. I actually look at my life and I work really hard, but I consider myself semi-retired.
Yes.
And I've been semi-retired since my 20s because I've never wanted to get caught up in that world. And I think what it taught me is that having, you know, a big house has no bearing at all on the lifestyle you choose to have.
No.
So I don't worry about it so much now.
Sometimes it's the opposite. I've just started reading Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, and I've just started it. And right at the beginning, she says that her father said he never wanted to be house poor. He never wanted them to be house poor. So he'd rather give them the flexibility and the quality of life than get stuck in what he saw as the whole mortgage trap. I think this time over the last 6 months, from bushfires to floods to global pandemic, has given all of us a chance to reflect on the way that we live. You were smart enough with your partner, your life partner, to get this early and have done it. Nigel, I could talk forever, but we are out of time. There's always so much to learn from you. And I love, the first one I love is, what would Dennis do? I think that's a great takeaway for anyone that's heard that story. The second one is that the really successful people find the gaps and then work to it. And the other thing that I really like from you is the whole creativity piece. What stops us from being creative? So stop and think about that. Is it fear? Is it time? Is it your perception? Because we all have it within us. Is there anything else that you want to add to that?
No, because if I do, we'll be another 40 minutes.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll talk to you again. All right. So there's a few things that I did want to say. For any information on speaking, facilitating, or your workshops, is it nigelcollin.com?
Yes. Or .com.au, either one.
Okay, Nigel Collin, well, let's say like nigelcollin.com.au for all things if you want Nigel to speak post-COVID, or, you know, interested in his workshops or any of the work that he has done. Ingenious Oz, where can we see that?
ingenioussoz.com.au, and Oz is OZ.
OZ, okay, thank you. Yep. What about Big Pivot, if we want to watch any Big Pivot?
They're all on our, so Ingenious Oz also has they're on the Ingenious site, actually.
Okay.
So all the
also on the Ingenious site. Game of Inches, your book, will explain lots more of the stuff that you've been talking about today. Where can people buy that?
Probably best just to jump on Booktopia, to be honest.
Okay.
Or jump on my website, either way. But yeah.
Either way, Game of Inches, excellent book. You will all learn something from it. Nigel Collin, you're awesome. You've been a delight. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Love
you to bits.
For having me.
Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. And thank you, everybody, so much for listening. Now, if you like what you've heard, you may like my program Working with People You Just Don't Get. So in this, we determine what your behavioural preference is for: apple, mango, lime, or banana. Once we do that, we look at the strengths and challenges of each and how we can work more effectively together. Because when we do, we have less stress, we have greater productivity, and we get better results all round. Now, the program comes in many forms. You can choose a webinar. You may like a video with a live Zoom Q&A after it. If you're all back in the workplace together, there's a lovely video training series that you can run yourself. Perhaps you'd like to book me post-COVID for a face-to-face workshop or a conference gig, or maybe just take a look at the book, Bite Me, and Other Do's and Don'ts of Dealing with Our Differences. Now, all this and more can be found on my website, linscanella.com.au, and you can also do a taster of the quiz there to get a feel for what you are. Now, if you've liked what you've heard, please like us, subscribe, leave a review. That would be awesome. I am on Facebook, Insta, and LinkedIn, so please join me there so we can stay as connected as possible in this weird and wonderful world in which we live. Respect, connect, thrive. I'm Lynn Scanella, and this has been Fruitful Conversations.